The architecture of a late-night talk show is designed to be a fortress of comfort. From the warm, honey-colored lighting to the enthusiastic, applause-ready audience, every element is engineered to make the viewer at home feel safe and the celebrity guest feel worshipped. It is a symbiotic ecosystem where actors sell their movies, hosts sell their charm, and the audience buys the illusion of friendship. But on a Tuesday night that would go down in television history, that illusion didn't just crack. It shattered into 1,000 irreparable pieces. Mark Wahlberg, a man who has navigated the treacherous waters from troubled youth to A-list superstardom, walked onto Jimmy Kimmel's stage expecting the usual dance. He expected the softball questions, the clips from his new action movie, and the rehearsed anecdotes about family life. What he got instead was an ambush that would leave the industry reeling and force a national conversation about the limits of comedy and the nature of forgiveness. The energy in the studio was strange from the very beginning, a subtle frequency of dissonance that seasoned production assistants picked up on immediately. Usually, the pre-show warm-up is a time of loose banter and high energy, but Jimmy Kimmel seemed different tonight. He was sharper, more agitated, pacing backstage with a nervous energy that looked less like excitement and more like a predator circling a cage. When the band struck up the intro music, it felt aggressive, loud, and jarring. Kimmel walked out to his monologue spot, but his eyes didn't have that familiar twinkle of mischief. They held a flat, cold resolve. He delivered his opening jokes with a biting cadence, tearing into soft targets with a ferocity that drew nervous laughter rather than belly laughs. But the real target, it turned out, was waiting in the green room. When it came time to introduce the guest, Kimmel didn't use the standard laudatory adjectives. There was no talented, no incredible, no friend of the show. Instead, he leaned into the microphone, his voice dropping an octave into a tone that sat uncomfortably between sarcasm and genuine disdain. He introduced Mark Wahlberg not as a star, but as a liability, cracking a joke about hoping the actor wouldn't beat anyone up backstage. The line hung in the air, toxic and heavy. The audience laughed, because that is what audiences are trained to do when the applause sign flashes, but the laughter was thin. It was the sound of confusion. Wahlberg, walking out from the curtain, faltered for a fraction of a second. His professional mask slipped, revealing a flash of genuine irritation, before he reassembled his expression into a tight, polite smile. He waved, shook Kimmel's hand firmly, perhaps too firmly, and took his seat. But the air between the desk and the guest chair was already charged with static. Wahlberg settled in, adjusting his suit jacket, prepared to pivot to his film. He had spent decades answering for his past, decades apologizing, decades trying to build a legacy that overshadowed the violent mistakes of a 16-year-old boy in Dorchester. He assumed Kimmel's intro was just a clumsy, edgy opener, a misfire from a comedian trying too hard to be relevant. He was wrong. Kimmel leaned back in his chair, steeping his fingers, and looked at Wahlberg with the gaze of an inquisitor. He opened the interview not with a question about the movie, but with a jab about Wahlberg's age and his career choices, asking when he would finally retire from pretending to be tough. It was a deconstructive question, one meant to belittle the very genre that had made Wahlberg a global icon. Wahlberg's jaw tightened. You could see the muscles work beneath the skin, a physical manifestation of the restraint he was exercising. He answered diplomatically, speaking about the audience's desire for authentic stories about real people overcoming odds. It was a good answer, a safe answer. It should have been the bridge to the promotional clip. But Kimmel wasn't interested in bridges. He was interested in burning them. He latched onto the word authentic like a dog with a bone. He mocked the idea of a millionaire actor living in Beverly Hills claiming any connection to the streets of Boston. The studio felt uncomfortably quiet. The house band members, usually grinning and nodding, exchanged worried glances. This wasn't playful ribbing. This was an attack on Wahlberg's identity, a stripping away of the narrative he had built his life around. Wahlberg leaned forward slightly, his posture shifting from relaxed to defensive. He spoke clearly, his voice controlled but firm, reminding Kimmel that he had never pretended to be anything he wasn't. He spoke of his transparency, of owning his past mistakes, and of the work he had done to make amends. It was a plea for a truce, a signal to the host to back off and return to the agreed-upon script of late-night promotion. But Kimmel was relentless. He seemingly ignored the tension he was creating, or perhaps he was feeding off it. He brought up the concept of the redemption arc, framing it not as a genuine spiritual journey, but as a marketing tactic. And then, he dropped the nuclear option. He asked, explicitly and cruelly, if Wahlberg thought his victims from the 1988 assault watched his movies and felt good about his success. The reference hit the studio like a sledgehammer. The air left the room. In the green room, Wahlberg's publicist dropped her phone, her hands shaking as she reached to signal the producers. This was a violation of every unwritten rule in Hollywood. You do not ambush a guest with their criminal record from 35 years ago during a fluff piece for an action movie. Wahlberg's Boston accent, usually softened for media appearances, came roaring back, hard and sharp. He called Kimmel out immediately, labeling the line of questioning inappropriate. He reiterated the facts. He was 16, he was on drugs, he was a child from a broken home, he served his time, and he had sought forgiveness. He wasn't hiding from it, but he refused to be defined by it in this context. Kimmel, however, seemed to have lost the ability to read the room. Or perhaps his ego wouldn't allow him to retreat. He pressed on, suggesting that Wahlberg's success was merely a result of fame acting as a shield against morality. He implied that the world had simply stopped caring about justice because Wahlberg was rich. It was a moral lecture delivered by a man in a tailored suit sitting behind a mahogany desk, and the hypocrisy began to grate on the audience. The silence in the room was deafening. Camera operators looked at the floor, uncomfortable witnessing the humiliation of a guest. But Wahlberg wasn't breaking. He was hardening. His hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of a man who is actively deciding not to reach across the desk and end the conversation physically. Slowly, deliberately, Mark Wahlberg stood up. It was a power move that shifted the geometry of the stage. Suddenly, Kimmel was looking up, craning his neck, diminishing his status. Wahlberg's voice dropped to a dangerous quiet, the kind of tone that is far more terrifying than a shout. He dismantled Kimmel's premise. He explained that he was there to support a film that employed hundreds of working-class people, to support families, to tell a story. He juxtaposed that constructive purpose against Kimmel's destructive intent. He accused the host of dragging up the darkest moments of a man's life for a cheap laugh, for a fleeting viral moment. Kimmel, however, seemed to have lost the ability to read the room. Or perhaps his ego wouldn't allow him to retreat. He pressed on, suggesting that Wahlberg's success was merely a result of fame acting as a shield against morality. He implied that the world had simply stopped caring about justice because Wahlberg was rich. It was a moral lecture delivered by a man in a tailored suit sitting behind a mahogany desk, and the hypocrisy began to grate on the audience. The silence in the room was deafening. Camera operators looked at the floor, uncomfortable witnessing the humiliation of a guest. But Wahlberg wasn't breaking. He was hardening. His hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of a man who is actively deciding not to reach across the desk and end the conversation physically. Slowly, deliberately, Mark Wahlberg stood up. It was a power move that shifted the geometry of the stage. Suddenly, Kimmel was looking up, craning his neck, diminishing his status. Wahlberg's voice dropped to a dangerous quiet, the kind of tone that is far more terrifying than a shout. He dismantled Kimmel's premise. He explained that he was there to support a film that employed hundreds of working-class people, to support families, to tell a story. He juxtaposed that constructive purpose against Kimmel's destructive intent. He accused the host of dragging up the darkest moments of a man's life for a cheap laugh, for a fleeting viral moment. In a panic, Kimmel lashed out with the specific details of the 1988 blinding incident again, a cruel, low blow meant to silence Wahlberg with shame. It had the opposite effect. The studio froze. It was a moment of pure cruelty, devoid of any comedic merit. Wahlberg went rigid. His hands clenched into fists, the knuckles turning white. For a terrifying heartbeat, violence seemed inevitable. Then, Wahlberg spoke two words that shifted the power dynamic permanently. Get up. It wasn't a shout. It was a command. He challenged Kimmel to stand up and say those words to his face, man to man, without the wooden barricade of the desk between them. Kimmel remained seated, paralyzed. His bravado crumbled into dust. He looked small, shrunken in his expensive suit. He tried to suggest a break again, his voice cracking. Wahlberg's voice boomed then, demanding courage. demanding that if Kimmel wanted to judge a man's life, he should do it looking him in the eye. The confrontation had moved beyond anger into a moral dressing down. Wahlberg diagnosed Kimmel's problem with surgical precision. He told him that years of hiding behind sarcasm had eroded his humanity. He told him that he had confused entertainment with a license to be cruel. Kimmel, cornered, fell back on the excuse of just doing my job. Wahlberg's laugh was harsh, a bark of disbelief. He redefined the job description for the host. The job was to uplift, to distract, to entertain, not to conduct a televised trial for personal sport. The audience began to murmur, the tide turning decisively against the host. People in the front row were live tweeting the meltdown, sending shockwaves through the internet before the segment even ended. Producers were screaming at each other, debating whether to cut the feed, but the spectacle was too mesmerizing to look away from. Kimmel finally stood up, but it was a mistake. Standing next to Wahlberg, the physical difference was stark. Wahlberg radiated a grounded, kinetic power. Kimmel looked shaky, unmoored. Kimmel tried to accuse Wahlberg of thinking he was better than everyone else, of acting like a saint because he donated money. Wahlberg shook his head, looking at Kimmel not with rage, but with disgust. He spoke of the difference between accountability and exploitation. He spoke of owning mistakes versus profiting from pain. Kimmel, losing all sense of strategy, insulted Wahlberg's profession, reducing him to a puppet who reads lines. That was the final nail. The audience, who respected Wahlberg's work, felt the insult keenly. Several stood up and walked out, a visual vote of no confidence in the host. Wahlberg turned that insult around masterfully. He admitted he read lines, but noted that when he played a character, he was honest about it. He accused Kimmel of playing a character for so long, the nice guy, the everyman, that he had forgotten who he actually was. He exposed the fraudulence at the heart of the show. Kimmel, face bright red, veins bulging, finally snapped and told Wahlberg to get out. It was a petulant dismissal, the last resort of a man who knows he has lost the argument. Wahlberg's voice rose in righteous indignation. After the ambush, after the humiliation, after the personal attacks, now he was being dismissed? He refused to be swept away like trash. He reminded Kimmel that he was an invited guest. He reminded the room that the host had a duty of care that he had spectacularly failed to uphold. He dismantled the idea that these were tough questions. Tough questions, he argued, were about the work, the art, the difficult choices of a career. These were just insults wrapped in the guise of an interview. The silence in the studio was absolute. The background music had died out long ago. It was just two men in a pool of light, stripping each other bare. Wahlberg lowered his voice to a whisper that carried to the back of the room. He told Kimmel the saddest truth of all, that Kimmel was actually talented, actually funny, but had chosen cruelty because it was easier. It was a critique that hit harder than a fist. Kimmel's eyes welled up. He tried to defend himself, telling Wahlberg not to psychoanalyze him, but it was feeble. Wahlberg countered that he didn't need to know Kimmel's history because Kimmel hid it. Wahlberg, at least, lived in the light of his own failures. Kimmel slammed his desk, screaming that it was his show, his cameras, his rules. It was a tantrum. Wahlberg stepped back, observing the outburst with the detachment of a judge. He pointed it out to the room. There it is. He identified the real Jimmy Kimmel, not the charmer, but the insecure bully. The mask had fallen completely. Kimmel looked around for allies, but found only the averted gazes of his staff. He was alone on his own island. Wahlberg delivered his closing statement. He spoke of his preparedness to be vulnerable, to have a real conversation about redemption. He spoke of how real people handle failure. And then he pointed the finger of accusation. He told Kimmel that he saw vulnerability as weakness, honesty as a target. He had taken a man's trauma and tried to turn it into a monologue joke. And then, he turned his attention to the audience. He told Kimmel that the people in the seats deserved better. They came for joy, and he gave them ugliness. Slowly, a sound began to build in the room. One person clapped, then another, then a row. It wasn't raucous cheering. It was a slow, steady wave of applause for dignity. They were applauding the man who stood his ground. Kimmel, broken, whispered that maybe they had gotten carried away. Wahlberg corrected him one last time. You got carried away. He rejected the shared responsibility. He had tried to be professional. Kimmel had chosen the low road. Wahlberg reached up, and unclipped his microphone. The sound of it brushing against his lapel was magnified in the quiet room. He declared he was done. He refused to be associated with the show or the man. Kimmel tried to beg to stop him, but Wahlberg cut him off. He told him that choices have consequences. He handed the mic to a stunned sound technician and turned his back on the desk. The applause swelled, a standing ovation for the guest walking out. At the edge of the stage, Wahlberg paused and looked back. He offered a final piece of advice, a warning disguised as wisdom. He told Kimmel to learn from this, because Hollywood tolerates a lot, but it hates a bully who attacks the invited. With that, he vanished into the wings. Kimmel was left standing in the wreckage of his own show, staring at the empty space where his guest had been. The producers cut to black, but the image of the empty stage was burned into the minds of millions. The aftermath was swift. The internet exploded. Mark Wahlberg trended globally. Advertisers pulled out. The network panicked. Wahlberg walked out of the building, met by his team, and expressed only disappointment. He had hoped the industry was better than this. He had hoped that redemption meant something. But in standing up for himself, he had proven that dignity cannot be taken. It can only be surrendered, and he had kept his. Jimmy Kimmel's reputation took a hit from which it would struggle to recover, while Mark Wahlberg walked away, not just as an action star, but as a man who refused to be broken by the past.